All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this. Morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this session with Gregory and myself, talking about from DevOps to DevOps. Couple quick house cleaning notes. We will be recording this, and we'll send it out to those who are registered afterwards, or a link to where you can view it. Additionally, if you have any questions throughout the presentation and the discussion that we're having here today, feel free to leave those questions in the questions area. We do have some folks monitoring those, and we will answer those throughout the talks. We'll take a look at them and see how those are going. And other than that, I'd like to introduce both myself. I'm Adam Atanasio. I'm the functional product manager over here at Parasoft. And on the call with me today, I do have Grigory Trofimov. Is that how you say that, Grigory? I don't know if I've ever tried to say your last name before.
No, that's it.
He's a senior solutions engineer over here at Parasoft. And then, unfortunately, we do not have Jeffrey Peoples with us today. He's having some internet issues, and so he is monitoring the chats, and will be pinging us when questions come up. Unfortunately, we weren't able to keep his video stable today for this, so we will work from there. So I guess a great way to start this, Grigory, is, what is DevOps? I mean, what is your definition of DevOps? I have some things popping up here from OpenCell and Atlassian and 3Pillar and AWS and Cloud Direct, and they all kind of use the same thing. What, in your opinion, kind of what is DevOps?
Well, I think these definitions here, like you said, they all kind of use the same thing. I think it's probably pretty accurate, right? It's a combination of development and IT functions to achieve a more efficient and streamlined software development process, right? So it's really a software development practice. It's a software development practice that stems from the requirement of Agile to deploy frequently and to deploy consistently and to deploy securely, right? So traditionally,
Okay.
with waterfall, we had you know a year to develop an application, and the IT team, a siloed IT team, had a lot of time to stand up infrastructure and prepare the environment for deployment, for production, etc. With Agile, we don't have that time, right? It's releases are frequent, and therefore IT teams also have to sort of adhere to that velocity and adhere to that agility. And really, the best way to do that is to merge. To merge some of those practices, to merge some of those philosophies, merge technologies into your source code as well, to basically have a streamline, a rapid development and deployment process, which we call DevOps.
Gotcha.
That's what it means
Great.
to me.
Great. Well, just kind of going off some current events situations. If you look at the image behind me, obviously this is the one of the new pictures that just came in yesterday from the James Webb Space Telescope. And if we look at the image I have up on the screen now, this is a combination of the Hubble telescope on the left, might be on the right for you folks, and the much clearer image that came from James Webb about 25, 35 years later. And I kind of bring this up because I thought it was very, very pertinent in the conversation that we're having today. If we look back at the days when Hubble was launched, that was done in a very, very waterfall type of scenario. And now we look at JWST, and you think, well, does NASA use DevOps? And it's interesting because you run a DevOps at NASA Google search, and you can see they definitely use DevOps to do things like get JWST in the air and bring back these beautiful images to us, because they're working with a lot of diversified teams on a lot of big projects all across the globe. And they kind of need to keep it organized in a way while teams are getting different pieces done. So, part of the way that this is titled is from DevOps to DevOps. And so in a kind of a DevOps type of scenario, back when they first launched Hubble, there was a problem with one of the lenses, and it took us almost 2 years to get people up into space to fix that lens and basically give Hubble a contact and a pair of glasses. It took a really, really long time to do that. And obviously, I mean, it's NASA. I mean, it took 30 years, almost 30 years to build the telescope that's just out there now, 1 million miles from Earth. But this one can't be fixed. It's 1 million miles past the moon, floating out there in space.
4 times the distance,
So,
right?
It's 4 times the distance of the moon. Yeah, it's way, way out there, and it's locked in a it's locked in an orbit that's out there that I don't even ask me the math on it. I have a friend of mine that's one of the engineers up there, and she understands the math really well.
Is he a
I could
DevOps
never
engineer?
even. Yeah. Well, no, she's actually a mathematician. So, but they definitely work in with the DevOps teams that are out there. So, so talking about some of the oops that are out there, what are some of the big challenges that you've seen, or some of the mistakes that companies have made when trying to implement and move from, say, Agile to DevOps, or from waterfall to DevOps?
Great question. So I think you kind of have to start with, why, again, why are you doing DevOps, right? It's the idea there is to make your life easier, right? It's to make your life easier, to adhere to a rapid pace of development, um, and frankly, to give teams more independence and teams more autonomy. And so when you start evaluating, um, DevOps versus DevOps, number one is, of course, siloed teams, right? If you're doing, if you as an organization, if you're the complete organization is doing some, digital transportation, and everybody's doing DevOps, um, but teams are still siloed, and you still have dedicated QA teams, you still have dedicated dev teams, you still have dedicated DevOps teams. You're really missing out on DevOps, and you can feel that it's really a DevOps, not a DevOps, because frankly, it doesn't really make your life easier, right? Because you're still having to wait on, some internal ticketing system where somebody has to provision a VM somewhere, or somebody has to provision maybe a Docker instance or something like that. Those things, they are, um, they're really a symptom of a problem, that you're doing DevOps just to do it, and not really doing DevOps to follow the fundamental guiding principles of DevOps. And I see you actually, yeah,
Gotcha.
you got you got the loop there, and we can really go through this loop just piece by piece, and really identify, okay, if you're not doing, for example, um, automated deployments, so you're not doing automated monitoring, right? That's of course a big oops, because you're not getting fast enough feedback from your continuous delivery pipelines. The biggest one, and probably one of the most important ones, and one of the ones that we hammer on all the time, is not doing enough testing, or not doing enough test automation, or maybe not doing, or not having an efficient or scalable test automation strategy, right? That
Sure.
lower that lower left, uh, part of this loop here, if that gets bloated, or if that is not automated in some way, that breaks the whole chain, that breaks the whole loop. So that's another big DevOps. And finally, overdoing it is really, is another big one as well, right? I mean, we can really kind of buy into DevOps to an extent that, you know we have to do all these DevOps things. We have to automate all of our infrastructure. We have to put everything into the cloud. We have to, make everything change, change dependent, or change resilient, and things like that. And sometimes that really just adds overhead, and you kind of have to take a step back and think, okay, like what is going to make my team more efficient? What is going to make my team more independent? Do I really need to, put all this data into Docker? You know, that's another big oops, is kind of overextending yourself, trying to follow core principles, but not necessarily establishing a benefit from those principles for your
That
team specifically.
That's interesting. I never thought of the perspective of overdoing it. And thinking about it now, I can definitely see where that could come into play. I mean, one of the philosophies I've kind of brought to the table and use and stick around with that I learned a long time ago is, fail fast and fail often, which sounds like a bad thing, right? Because failure is supposed to be bad, but in kind of an agile type of structure, you want to know if something is not going to work as quickly as possible, right? So you don't want to spend months and months and months developing something and then find out months later that what you developed has no value whatsoever. And
Mhm.
so when you work in this kind of iterative process, um, knowing it's not going to work very, very quickly means that you can move on to the next thing and find the next things that are going to be successful. And that's kind of what I mean by the fail fast and fail often part of it. But to kind of bring that back, I had never thought about that in the way of uh, overdoing it, right? Um, you you want to have certain teams that are working on, say, one aspect of the project that is always running smooth and always moving through the process, and while you have other teams that are innovating and creating new services. When a company is um, integrating DevOps kind of for the first time, in your opinion, should they stand up an entire team that's all DevOps and it's all new from the outside, or should they integrate some of the folks that have more of the business knowledge and kind of the pulse on the business that's there? Because one of the things that you run into, right, is resistance to change within an organization.
The question you have to ask yourself is, are you empowering your staff? Are you empowering your team to make decisions independently? And if the answer to that question is no, the team still depends on somebody else. The team depends on another team in order to make their own decisions, and um, you know, are don't necessarily have the opportunity to learn from their own mistakes and maintain that within their own team. Then you're not really doing yourself a service or your team a service, and you're probably not implementing DevOps um, in the most effective or scalable way. So siloed teams in any shape or form, whether it's a dedicated DevOps team or dedicated something else team, um, probably would consider a DevOps. I'm sure there's probably some scenario, there's probably some edge case where you could argue and say, well, this just makes more sense, and this is more streamlined and this is more efficient. Again, you have to kind of do and evaluate what makes sense for you, and your organization, your team. But generally speaking, silo teams of DevOps, if you have a dedicated DevOps team, that's a DevOps. A more common team makeup would probably be something like a team of 10 folks, right? A pizza team, they call them sometimes, right?
A
Five
pizza team?
pizza, right? It's
I haven't heard that one before.
well, it's supposed to be enough people that you can share a pie of pizza with, but
Okay.
10 people, I mean, everybody maybe gets one slice, right? That's maybe want two pizzas. A two pizza team.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes
So,
sense.
so you're looking for two pizza teams, about five dev, and maybe two DevOps folks, quality assurance engineers, test automation engineers, and business analyst or a product owner, right? That I think that's a more scalable team makeup, and I think that's probably what we see more common with mature organizations who have really implemented DevOps and been able to take off with that. But I also
Gotcha.
kind of wanted to comment on something that you said a little bit earlier about failing fast and failing often, because I'm glad you brought that up. Um, a core fundamental principle of DevOps is to plan in small batches, right? And that's kind of
Hmm.
that's where we get away from sort of our agile philosophy or wagile philosophy, right? You want to increment by small margins. Now, that's not to say do little work. Of course you can implement significant changes. You can implement big features, but you can still plan small, right? And that's
Sure.
because we have small increments of time that we need to work in. So in those small increments of time, we need to test as much as we can. We need to implement as much as we can, but we also want to get feedback as fast as possible. And that's really where, move fast and fail frequently or break things and things like that. That's why that's so encouraged, because we're getting feedback quickly, right? So we can know, we can go back and immediately fix these problems without them making their way further down in the software development lifecycle.
Gotcha. Yeah, and you use a term there that I'm quite fond of, because I've seen it many times throughout my career, is WAGILE. Um, and one of the questions I was actually going to ask you, and this kind of draws to that, is, can Agile and Waterfall work together? And that's so commonly known as WAGILE. And what are your thoughts on that, especially when a team is transitioning from Waterfall into Agile and DevOps moving forward?
Uh, yeah, and I think again, I think that there's probably a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. But I think it's inevitable for organizations that are transitioning from waterfall to agile to find themselves in some sort of agile scenario. You can't make these changes overnight, and that's probably another DevOps, or something that you can really kind of introduce introduce obstacles for your team, is when you say, okay, everybody stop doing what you're doing the way you're doing today, and everybody do everything different. Here's a few new folks on your team. Let's all do DevOps, right? It doesn't work like that. You can't just change everything overnight and expect the teams to adjust. Expect the quality of your application and quality practices when it comes down to validating your application to sort of keep up with that type of change. So as a transition, you're going to have that period. Teams that are starting fresh new projects, you probably want to stick to the most sort of stringent definitions of DevOps or Agile, and just the name of efficiency, and just in the name of kind of getting those core practices and things in place as early on as possible. But transitioning teams, yeah, I mean, you're going to see Agile, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's it's just what makes sense for that team.
Gotcha. Well, and I guess that kind of brings me to, we talked about dedicated teams and the transitions, and the effects that it can have within the organization. Some of those being on QA. Um, what about on infrastructure? Especially when you're making that transition. So when you're in kind of a non-DevOps environment, you might have, one set of databases are working from live data, for example. How do you see like databases being handled when the pipeline increases for data hungry applications? Now you're putting things out more quickly, more often. You're testing more often. You're testing from more teams, presumably. So you might have to hit that same database, say, from 20 different angles versus just from the main.
Right. Um,
So what are some of the issues that can arise from that?
so and again, we're kind of, I think at this point we're probably referring to the to the test automation piece of DevOps, right? And how we're able to actually, again, ensure quality at speed, at the agility, and also have a stable test environment for us to do
Mm-hmm.
that. So a stable test environment can become unstable for a number of reasons. You can have teams that are developing their services that your application integrates with on a different schedule. They could be external services. They can be
Right.
databases, and data requirements change, and all of a sudden you have multiple tests and multiple pipelines and test executions all testing within the same sort of data environment, which can cause issues from a testability perspective. And finally, there's cost, right? I mean, simply put, there's a lot of cost associated with
It's always a big one from the organizational standpoint, right?
Right, with maintaining those test environments and standing up additional test environments, right? I mean, you could also always make the argument, so well, just stand up another test environment. Like, well, no, because I mean, sure, like our service just returns a JSON, but behind the scenes, there's like all these database calls, all these asynchronous calls, all these
Hmm.
other backend calls that are taking place. So the cost of standing up that test environment is um, can be can be pretty hefty. Um, Tools. So you have to look at tools. You have to look at solutions. I think DevOps, when we move from DevOps beyond software development practice, you really start looking at DevOps as a collection of tools and solutions that really enable things like continuous delivery, continuous testing, continuous integration, so on and so forth. So when we talk about test environment stability, that's service virtualization, that's test data management solutions. It's well, frankly, it's also your pipeline tools, right? So Jenkins is your DevOps, etc. Um, all those solutions can help aid in that. I would say test service virtualization is a big one, of course, because it actually allows you to stand up virtual databases, virtual services,
Hmm.
remove those dependencies from your test environments, and that's a very DevOpsy thing to do because again, you don't want to stand up real environments every single time you run a pipeline. Ideally, you run a pipeline anytime you make a change, right? So
Sure.
you can't incur that cost every time. So service virtualization, we're seeing great return on investment from organizations who invest heavily into service virtualization,
Gotcha.
um, and that's over long periods of time, right? That's over consecutive years, and um, that just kind of continues to grow.
Gotcha. So I know we've talked a lot about like what DevOps is and uh, kind of how to implement it and things like that. And to me, it sounds a lot like it's a culture change as well as just a structure change. Sounds like there's some culture change that needs to happen within an organization as well. Um, what has kind of been your experience in seeing how companies change and how they deal with the fatigue of that change. And the fatigue can obviously come from multiple different places, right? They're either dealing with the fatigue of waterfall and waterfall taking them so long before they get a product out there, or they're dealing from the fatigue of change where now they might have, fail fast, fail often. They might have 4 fails in a row, and there's a fatigue in there of just, well, we got to have a win, we got to have a win, we got to have a win, but they're just happening so fast that they're having to process it much faster. Um, what's kind of been your experience, or what kind of things have you seen in that way? And maybe you haven't because you're more on the solution side than on the product and
Well,
business
we make
development side.
everyone
But
successful, right? So we don't we don't see fatigue in that sense. No, but you're absolutely right. It is a culture change, and if you think about it too, I mean, DevOps, it kind of spills over. I mean, even by definition, right? I mean, what happens with DevOps is, all right, we're going outside of the development, software development, right? If we stop thinking for a second about DevOps as still being a software development um, only practice, right? It's an IT practice as well. We can do DevSecOps, so it's a security quality practice. It's there's GitOps, or I read a blog the other day about AppOps, which is another one. It's really about how this benefits your team, right? If your team if the fatigue is coming from the fact that, okay, well, we're doing all this DevOps stuff, right? We're deploying all these dynamic infrastructures and containers and things like that with every single iteration of our application, with every release, but we're not storing our Terraform file configurations, or we're not storing our YAML files in source control, for example, right? We don't have a single source of truth. Okay, so that is going to introduce fatigue, right? Because now you have to go and look at all these places to figure out, okay, how do I deploy this application? Ideally, you have to follow those same core principles as inherent DevOps, right? So that's GitOps, for example. GitOps says, okay, you have to have a single source of truth, because that way, without it, your loop, it's not actually starting anywhere, right? This loop is kind of actually in a number of different places. Um, so sorry, going back to your question, about culture change. um, it spills over into other facets of the organization as well, right? So your team, again, should be independent, should be able to do its own type of DevOps, or its own DevOps, really, that makes sense for the team. But as an organization, you have to adjust with that. You have to adjust to a rapid release cycle. You have to practice change management. You can practice change management in every aspect of the way, right? If you're planning in small
Gotcha.
batches, as we mentioned earlier, then it makes it that much easier to practice change management, and understand, is your quality practice good enough? Is this release fully tested? Are there um, risky code changes that you can be
Mhm.
implementing based on the changes um, that you've made? So yeah, absolutely. It's it takes a village, but at the end of the day, we're really using DevOps to kind of break things down into smaller problems and fix smaller
Gotcha.
problems. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, see, one of the things that you had mentioned when talking about that was security, right? So you said you're talking about DevSecOps. Um, security is one of those interesting pieces because there are so many different facets that security covers. But in this question, I'm more talking about like in the code, like when should, say, security be tested within the pipeline, within the coding pipeline, or as you shift left, where in that process should security be implemented and tested?
I think in terms of bringing security into um, into your sort of core quality practice, that's probably the one that's lagging behind the most. I would say that with with many organizations that we work with, and again, mature organizations, you'll see that they're definitely embedding those security practices directly into the earliest stages of software development, whether it's with static analysis, flow analysis, metrics gathering, etc., adhering to things like OWASP or CWE, right? There's tons of tools out there that can do that for you. There's Zap, there's Burp Suite, there's our static analysis
Mhm.
tools, right? And then once you actually deploy the application, once you make your way further in that loop, um, that's when you start looking at things like, instead of SAST, instead of static analysis, you're looking at dynamic analysis, right? That's penetration, that's Burp Suite, that's Zap. That's when you can validate whether or not your application is secured, from that perspective. Organizations are having a hard time, I think, embedding that into their software development teams. I mean, it's
Gotcha.
basically, when we talk about the team makeup, you're basically saying, okay, let's add another security person now. All of a sudden, we're not a two pizza team, we're more of like a three pizza team, right? And it's and
Sure.
and then the team starts growing. So I think a lot of organizations still opt out for dedicated security teams, but we are seeing a lot of tools. Again, DevOps is, I think, largely a set of tools that enable teams and enable these practices. We are seeing tools that are allowing um, teams to do more security testing on their own without necessarily having to um, uh, collaborate as much with security teams. But I mean, no organization is going to get rid of their security team, right?
Right.
You're not going to break that team up either, right? So there's always going to be a dedicated security team, but things like static analysis, things like
And
penetration testing, that's gonna go a long way.
some of the tools that you're talking about would be, I mean, you mentioned Zap and you mentioned OWASP. I know we just did a bunch of stuff around OWASP recently. Um, you know, there was one other one that you mentioned there after OWASP. CWE, was that it?
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. Um, and so those are things that can really be tested kind of earlier in the process, right? Like during, where would that type of test be running? Would that be in the
Well, CWE, like many um, like many of those directives and many of those guidelines, they have there's kind of different without without diving too deep into it. You have different things that you can validate. You can validate things via static analysis, which is basically um, either preventative or detective uh, analysis of your code, right? So when you look directly at the source code and you're looking at various best practices, you're looking at, things like, if you use this statement here, then make sure you're using this statement there, right? That's a preventative static analysis that you can check for certain things that CWE specifically outlines or OWASP specifically outlines or some other directive outlines. Usually there's different sections, things that you can validate using
Hmm.
static analysis, and then there's process oriented things that you really kind of have to look at your maybe application configuration, right, and your deployment configuration, and make sure, okay, that you're deploying your application correctly and that those configurations are secure. And that you can't really check with static analysis. That's more of maybe some other kind of scanning tool that that will actually scan your deployment. Internally, we do things like dependency checkers, right? So you want to,
Hmm.
especially with Log4j, right? Ever since that happened, I think I get so many more emails now about various vulnerabilities and this library has this and that library has this. It's really picked up in pace, and I think those dependency checker tools and solutions have also picked up for a lot of organizations. Um, and then there's things like cross-site scripting attacks, right? So those are actual attacks that you have to make sure your application is prepared to handle, and that's really where you get into the penetration testing stuff, right? So Zap and Burp Suite, they'll actually execute those attacks against your application. They'll check your headers. They'll make sure that if there's a buffer overflow, you're throwing the right errors and things like that. So um, sorry,
No,
what was the question again?
I mean, it was about security and when to implement security in
Right,
there,
right,
and
right. So everywhere,
um,
yes, you
yeah,
have to implement security everywhere, and CWE
everywhere
and
and always, right?
everywhere and always, right? And and
Yeah,
and those guidelines have actually evolved. They have certainly evolved from the recent years to include the everywhere piece, and make sure you're looking at security from a broad DevOps
right,
perspective, not just your code, not just your methods and classes and things like that.
right. Yeah, and you know, I know you know this, but a lot of the audience doesn't. So I've only been in this space since January. So a lot of this stuff is new to me. Been in the IT space for a very, very long time, but not on the testing side. And so I hear of, especially being the product manager, I hear all the different things that we're working on and help guide things like whether it's Log4j, whether it's OWASP, whether it's CWE. Um, I hear all the different things that we're putting into this. We're actually doing a webinar next month about application security insights. So, it's definitely something. If anybody's listening, you might want to check out next month as well, because we do have a lot of insight coming in on that as well. And I learn every time I have one of these conversations, especially with like you, Grigori. You teach me so much just listening to you talk
Oh,
about this stuff. Uh, so because coming from hardware and from other types of software and SaaS environments, and not down at this level of the testing side of it, it's very, very interesting insight that I get from you and get from Wilhelm and things like that on our team. Um, so
well, I guess maybe a question then to you. I mean, from from your
shoot,
perspective, and as you've kind of as you mentioned, in this space, I know, at Parasoft we have sort of our way of implementing DevOps, right, and our way of implementing Agile, and where do you see kind of how our transformation and how we're implementing these practices, where they're kind of adding, and where um, it could maybe present some challenges.
sure. So one of the things that I was probably the most impressed by when I came on board with Parasoft was the self-organization of the teams. The way that the teams just they really run themselves. They get, they let us on the PM side kind of do what we do, which is say, this is what we need it to do. And I think we've been pretty good on the PM side. I'm a little biased at saying we're not going to tell you how to do it. You guys are going to tell us how you're going to do it. This is just what we need it to do, right? And so that's been great. I know that we're still at certain levels of implementing ourselves, in the fact that we release every 6 months as opposed to every 2 weeks like some agile environments do. But we also have like our marketplace where we actually can release stuff on this very quickly and get it out there even when we're in between release cycles, because we tend to release it in themes with our release cycles. So I think we're doing a great job transitioning into that, and I think it gives us a little bit of an advantage in a lot of ways, because we are writing tools to help companies with DevOps, right? So I mean that's a lot of what our product does, is help this entire process down the line. But we're writing tools that we use ourselves internally to test our own software for testing. It's one of those crazy loops of chicken and egg. But I from where I'm at so far, I think what I've seen is we've done a great job. I've seen some companies do some terrible things. I've seen organizations like Live Nation, which are massive organizations with thousands of developers, that have never ever been able to break out of a Agile space, right? So there's almost as many different ways to do Agile as there are people doing Agile, because every team's going to implement it differently. But that's part of the benefit of working in that type of environment, is you let your teams kind of self organize and work on the strengths of each person on the team. And so I think the way that we've organized so far has been great. And I know that we're always working on new ways to implement and improve and get better and increase our velocities and make our teams happier, and that balance of life and work and everything else. So that's been great.
Awesome.
So I guess we're getting kind of close to the end here. So we got about 7 minutes left. So I want to open this up to some questions. If anybody has any questions out there, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I know we've gone through a lot of different things, and I've asked a lot of questions. But if you have anything new that comes up, or ideas that come up that you want to know a little bit more about, please let me know on that.
Or feel free to share your experiences. I mean,
yeah,
I'm
please.
sure your teams are going through an agile transformation, or have gone through an agile transformation, or maybe started fresh with agile. So be curious to hear.
Yeah. So just as kind of a last bit here in the last few minutes, we have a lot of products available that we've built, and I know we've talked a little bit about that. And I'm just working on pulling up a slide here. Let me get down to that section. And we are, there we go. All right. So we have a lot of products and services that hit all kind of different levels of the pyramid. So I know you've worked with and work a lot on these products. I work on the functional products, which is going to be our SOA test and virtualize and Selenic. I'm not so much on the unit testing and code analysis sides of it. It looks like we cover a big section of the testing pyramid. Can you talk a brief?
Why, right? well,
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, if we kind of look back at that, I keep referring to the little DevOps loop, but it's so critical there, right? To have that little test piece there, because without test automation, you really can't do DevOps. You can't do rapid delivery. You can't do agile software delivery without without test, being able to either, match the speed of development, or frankly, a lot of times having to stay a few steps ahead, right? Because the changes that the team is working on, the changes the team is implementing, if you have to wait for those changes to actually take place, for um, you don't want to drag testing into the next sprint, right?
Sure.
So the test pyramid, as defined by a few a few great sort of thinkers in this space, Martin Fowler and um, Michael Cohen, um,
Hmm.
is really a strategy to define an efficient and a scalable test automation practice, right? And when you look at this test pyramid, I think we've kind of drawn the lines here on in different things, whether it's code analysis and unit testing and API testing and UI testing. I think focusing on these sort of names and titles is it isn't as important as the fundamental principle that the smaller the scope of your test, the more of those tests you should have, right? That's where the efficiency gain is. Again, plan small, fail small. um, that really helps with DevOps, and it really helps with agile delivery. So if you look at this test pyramid, on the bottom, you have low scope tests, whether it's unit tests, whether it's things like static analysis, where you're looking or you're testing a very, very small component. And then as you're working your way up, you have integration tests, you have API tests, you have um, uh, you know contract tests, right? There's many different verbiages and definitions of different test types that you can kind of call out as you work your way up the test pyramid.
Gotcha.
But the idea is that you get to the top, and that's where you have your end-to-end tests, UI tests, et cetera, user acceptance test. And we know that they're much easier to define, right? It's a lot easier
Gotcha.
to
Yep.
define those tests because they're defined already for us. Realistically, they're defined as features. They're defined as requirements. So if I'm testing that requirement, if I'm testing that feature, it's a lot easier for me to just go to, load up my application, log in, and make sure I can create a contact, or I can um, you know uh, add some item to a shopping cart or something like that. It's already defined in a human readable language. It's easier to define that test. But running those tests costs time, costs human interaction with the application, right? And it's difficult to automate. So the test pyramid is there to make sure that you have different tools and different approaches to the quality of your application, and you can implement this as an automation strategy, right? You can actually do this in a test automation space.
Gotcha. Well, great.
I,
That puts us right up against time. If you got one last bit there, we've got just about a
on the
minute and a
test
half
pyramid,
left.
yeah, an analogy that I really like with the test pyramid is, you've seen the sort of food nutrition pyramid, right? Um, where you have your carbs, and you have your fruits and veggies and things like that. I think the test pyramid is really kind of similar in that sense, right? Where there are certain things that are good for you. Like, you can't eat cake all the time.
Right.
You can't do only UI testing all the time. You have to do these other things. You have to have good practices in place to be healthy. Same thing with software testing. You have to.
Sounds like you're talking a lot about shift left, which we're going to have to take onto
Oh
another
no.
call. So just quick here, folks that are watching. So we've got a couple of QR codes up here for a couple of white papers that we have out there. So feel free to click on those. Like I said, this will also come out to you. The recording will be available to you shortly. Additionally, you can help guide the future of our products with our forums. We do have some forums out there, ideation, where you can let us know what some of the things you'd like to see in our products and services are. And we, as the product managers, we go through those often and take this to our development team if it's something that makes a lot of sense for us and works for our customers. And we've gotten a lot of great ideas in the past out there. So again, everybody, thank you for your time today. Gregory, thank you again for your time today, and I really, really appreciate the time that we spent. I learned a lot. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks, everybody.